2:17 in the morning. U.S. Route 2, northern Montana. I've been moving for about 4 hours and the road is empty in both directions as far as my headlights reach. That's when the knocking starts. 3 slow impacts from inside the trailer. Deliberate, spaced maybe 2 seconds apart. I take my foot off the accelerator and listen. The freight I'm carrying is light, packaged, properly secured. Nothing back there has the mass to produce that kind of sound, and nothing that shifts from road vibration keeps a rhythm. I wait 3 more knocks. Same interval. Same weight behind them. I check both mirrors. The trailer looks normal. Running lights, reflectors, the dark rectangle of the doors. Then I check the driver's side mirror more carefully. Angle of the view, back along the driver's side of the trailer, toward the rear. There is a shape near the back of the trailer that was not there a moment ago. It is the approximate size and proportion of a person. It isn't moving the way something would move if it were falling or scrambling. It's still, like it's standing there, moving with the truck. A pickup comes around a curve behind me. Its headlights sweep the road, the shoulder, the rear of my trailer. Nothing there. I keep driving. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. If you're the kind of person who finds yourself still awake at an unreasonable hour, looking for exactly this kind of story, a like and a subscription go a long way toward keeping this channel going. We have 5 accounts tonight from drivers who learned something about empty roads that they'd rather not know. Get comfortable and let's get into the first one. Story 1. The woman on Route 50. U.S. Route 50. Nevada. My name is Dale. 19 years of long-haul, mostly western routes. I say that so you have some sense of who you're listening to, and then I'll get out of the way and tell you what happened. I was hauling a load of manufactured components east across Nevada in late October. Ordinary freight, ordinary run. The sky that night was completely clear. I want to establish that specifically because what followed had nothing to do with weather or poor visibility. It was one of those desert nights where you can see half the galaxy and the road ahead is sharp and unambiguous as far as your lights reach. No fog, no rain, no wind worth mentioning. Route 50 through Nevada earns its reputation. There are stretches where you travel 40 or 50 miles without seeing a building or another vehicle. The road cuts across flat valley floors between mountain ranges, and the darkness on either side of your headlights is the kind that seems to have density. I find it comfortable. I have run that highway enough times that the silence feels ordinary. I was about 6 hours into the run, coffee still warm, radio on something I'd lose before long. Everything routine. I first saw her around mile marker 149. My headlights picked her up maybe 200 feet ahead on the right shoulder. A woman walking east, the same direction I was traveling. Dark jacket, jeans, practical shoes, long dark hair, walking at a steady, unhurried pace. I moved slightly left to give her room and passed. Checked my mirror. She kept walking. My immediate assumption was a broken-down vehicle somewhere behind her. It happens. Late at night on that highway, it's unusual, but not alarming. She hadn't tried to flag me down, and pulling a loaded semi onto a dark shoulder is not a simple operation. I figured she had a phone, or someone else would stop. I kept going. For the next 11 or 12 miles, I didn't think much about her. Then I saw her again. Same right shoulder, same direction, same jacket, same hair, same even pace. Walking east. I had been traveling at highway speed. I had not slowed, not stopped, not seen another vehicle. There is no mechanism by which a person on foot covers 11 miles in the time it takes a semi at 60 plus miles per hour to cover the same ground. There is also no plausible scenario where a vehicle passed me in the dark without my noticing, collected her, drove 11 miles ahead and deposited her. I would have seen headlights. There had been none. My first response was to try to make it work. 2 women on the same highway, walking the same direction, dressed similarly. Long shot, but I was willing to accept it. I passed her a second time. Checked the mirror. The same unhurried walk. I turned the radio off. 7 more miles. The road curved gently and straightened, and in the long, flat section ahead, she was standing on the shoulder. Not walking. Standing, facing the road. Facing me. I slowed and pulled over with the hazards going. She walked toward the passenger door at a normal pace. No urgency. I unlocked it. She climbed in and pulled it shut. Buckled the seatbelt without being asked. She was young, mid-20s, no visible injuries. Her clothes were dry. That was the first thing that didn't quite fit. It was around 30 degrees outside, and she had no gloves, no hat, no scarf, just the jacket. She should have been in worse shape than she appeared. "Thank you," she said, quiet voice, composed. I asked where she was headed. She named a small town about 60 miles further east, a real place. I asked about her car, and she said it had stopped a few miles back. When I asked what kind of vehicle, she paused before answering. Something vague, a dark-colored sedan. I asked where exactly she'd left it, and she gestured westward without turning to look. I asked whether she'd been traveling alone. She said there had been someone with her, but they'd gone for help. None of this was alarming on its face. People in shock or stress don't always track details well. But there was a quality to her answers, a slight delay before each one that made them feel considered rather than recalled. Like she was choosing what to say rather than remembering what had happened. I turned the heat vent toward her side and asked whether she needed to call someone. She said she was all right. We drove in relative quiet for a while. I asked if she had a phone. She didn't answer that one directly, just looked at the road ahead. The engine was steady, the desert dark on both sides, the reflectors ticking past. I let the silence sit. After a few minutes, she asked whether I was originally from Nevada. I said no, Ohio. She asked whether I had family there. I gave the short answer. My parents were gone and I didn't have siblings anymore. I've said that particular sentence enough times that it comes out automatically, the way you learn to deliver information that used to be hard. "Your sister?" she said. Not quite a question. "She was younger than you." I kept my eyes on the road for a moment, worked through it. There was no photograph of Karen visible in the cab. I had not mentioned her. I had said I didn't have siblings anymore, past tense, which could imply a death, but not a sister specifically, and certainly not her age relative to mine. "How do you know I had a sister?" I said. "She wanted someone to tell you she's all right," she said. "She said you'd been carrying it." I looked at the road. I took a breath. I thought about pulling over. I decided instead to keep moving and ask what she meant. And I turned to do that. The seat was empty. The seatbelt was still buckled, still pulled taut across the space where she'd been sitting. The way it stays when someone's wearing it. The passenger door had not opened. There was no chime, no cab light, no sound of the latch or the wind. I had heard nothing. I reached across and pressed my hand to the seat. Cold. Not the ambient cold of fabric in a parked car. Something more specific than that, like warmth had been drawn out of it. I pulled onto the shoulder and sat with the hazards going for several minutes. Did not get out, just sat. Eventually I said my sister's name out loud once, into the cab. Then I put it in gear. 28 miles further on was a small independent travel plaza. An older man behind the counter, quiet at that hour. He poured me coffee without being asked and let me sit. After a while, I described the woman. Not all of it, just what she looked like, where I'd seen her. That she'd been in my cab and then wasn't. He was quiet for a moment. Said carefully that a few drivers over the years had mentioned picking someone up on that stretch who wasn't where they expected her to be when they arrived. He didn't elaborate into legend. He said he'd always assumed it was tired drivers, but that enough people had described nearly the same thing that he'd stopped dismissing it outright. He asked if she'd said anything. I told him she'd asked about my family. He nodded like that wasn't new information and left it alone. I searched afterward over several weeks, road records, newspaper archives, what county databases I could access, nothing that matched what I'd seen. No incident I could point to. The following spring, I ran that route again at night. Near the spot where I'd first seen her, there was a small roadside memorial on the shoulder. A simple cross with some faded plastic flowers tied to it. I don't know whether it had been there the first time and I'd missed it, or whether someone had placed it after. I didn't stop to look closer. I've thought about what she said to me. The practical part of my mind knows that someone could guess at a dead sibling and get lucky. People die. Truckers get asked about family. Statistically, some percentage of us have lost a sibling. But the specific detail about Karen being younger, I had not said that, and the seatbelt was still latched. Not everything on a dark highway shows itself to you. Some of the most disorienting accounts I've come across don't involve seeing anything unusual at all, at least not at first. They involve hearing something. A voice on the radio, another driver ahead of you who knows the road better than seems possible. The next account comes from a driver who works the Dalton Highway in Alaska, which in February operates on its own set of rules entirely. Story 2, the voice ahead of me, Dalton Highway, Alaska. The Dalton Highway, in February, is a different environment from any road in the lower 48, and I say that having driven a lot of both. It's around 400 miles of two-lane, running north from Fairbanks toward the Arctic coast, carrying freight to oil field operations on the north slope. It runs through boreal forest, then open tundra, then mountain passes, then back to tundra. In winter, it does all of this in total darkness, with temperatures that can hit minus 40 before wind, and road surfaces that change character without warning, because the permafrost underneath shifts the pavement in ways that don't follow patterns. I've been running the Dalton for 11 years. My name is Marcus, and the reason I can do this job comfortably is that I approach it technically. I pay attention to my equipment, my conditions, my weather data, my traction, my fuel margins. On a road where the nearest significant help might be 60 miles away, you make decisions carefully, or you don't make them long. The run I want to describe was a northbound trip in early February. I was carrying freight, supplies, and equipment for one of the operations up the slope. I'd started from Fairbanks in the early evening and planned to make steady miles through the night. Conditions were workable. Wind around 20 miles per hour out of the northwest, temperatures near minus 28. Some blowing snow in exposed sections, but nothing that was closing the road. For the Dalton in February, that's a reasonable night. CB traffic on the Dalton is sparse by nature. Long sections have no traffic at all. Occasionally you'll hear North Slope maintenance, an equipment operator, another carrier. The radio fills silence more than it fills airtime. Around mile 175, I picked up a transmission. Northbound on the Dalton, watch the road surface coming off the hill at mile 188. Ice underneath, blowing snow. Right lane, especially. Take your time through there. I keyed back. Copy that, thanks. What's your position? Ahead of you, the voice said. Maybe 8 miles. Calm, older, not elderly, but somewhere in his 50s, I'd have said. The voice of someone who narrates road conditions the way an experienced doctor narrates a procedure. Precisely without theater. I noted the handle he used to sign off. North Star. Filed it and kept moving. The warning at mile 188 was accurate. The right lane had a layer of wind-packed snow over a sheet of ice that my front axle found before the rest of me was ready for it. I was already moving slowly because he'd told me to, and I came through without incident. Without that warning, I'd likely have been fine too. I was alert and scanning, but I was glad to have it. I got back on the radio. Good call on 188. What's the road looking like further north? North Star came back within a few seconds. Said there was a section of rutting near mile 196 where loaded northbound trucks had been breaking through the frost layer. Suggested I stay centered and maintain steady speed rather than braking in the ruts. I followed that advice too, and again it was exactly right. The ruts were there, and centered at steady speed was the correct approach. Here's where I started paying closer attention to the geometry of the situation. If North Star was 8 miles ahead of me at mile 175, and we were both moving northbound, he should have been pulling away from me, or at minimum holding the same interval, unless he was stopped. By mile 196, 21 miles after his first transmission, he should have been at least 29 miles north of me, probably more. I asked him directly, North Star, are you northbound or stationary? I'm trying to figure your position. Brief pause. Moving, he said. North. I can't pick up your taillights. What's your speed? Conditions have me slow, he said, which was a reasonable answer and not unusual. Over the next 40 minutes, he gave me 3 more pieces of information. A maintenance truck was parked on the right shoulder at mile 203. Lights off. Easy to miss in blowing snow. It was there. Dark. Right where he said. There was a crosswind exposure at mile 211 where the road comes out of a tree line and hits open tundra. He told me it would hit from the left and to give myself room, and it did, and I did. And around mile 218, he mentioned that there were caribou near the roadway in the next couple miles, that he'd passed them recently and they hadn't moved far. I saw 3 caribou at mile 220, standing maybe 30 feet off the right shoulder. Each piece of information was specific and accurate, not vague warnings, concrete observations about precise locations. And I never saw his taillights. Not once. I was looking. In clear conditions, I can see a mile of road on the straights. In blowing snow, my visibility dropped to maybe a quarter mile, but even then, I should have seen something. The red glow of running lights at a minimum. The road ahead of me was empty every time I checked. I started testing it methodically. I raised my speed by 5 miles per hour at mile 214. Held it for 2 miles. In any normal situation, I'd have been closing the distance to a truck ahead of me that was running slow in difficult conditions. I saw nothing. I reduced speed below what I'd been doing. Nothing changed in either direction. I tried dispatch. They confirmed I was the only truck they were tracking in that corridor from my carrier, and suggested North Star might be running under a different carrier's management system, maybe oil field traffic with separate dispatch. That was plausible. I accepted it, though it didn't explain the taillights. Then, somewhere around mile 231, North Star came back with something that wasn't a road warning. Marcus. Clear and direct. You've got about 27 miles to the rest facility. Stay awake. I had not given him my name. In every exchange I'd said copy or thanks or asked a procedural question. I had not identified myself. I said, say again? 27 miles. Stay awake, Marcus. Then the channel went quiet, and it stayed quiet. I tried to raise him 4 more times over the following hour. Nothing. At the rest facility, I talked to 2 drivers who had been there for several hours. Parked out a shift change. Neither had heard any transmissions from a handle called North Star during the period I was describing. One of them had been monitoring CB most of the evening and was confident he'd have heard if there was traffic on the channel. I mentioned the handle to an older driver who was getting ready to head south. He'd been running Alaskan freight for longer than I'd been licensed. He went quiet when I said the name, then asked me to describe the voice. I described it as best I could. Older, calm, deliberate, experienced. He said there had been a driver who used that handle years back. He described him not as a legend, but as a person he'd actually known. Someone who had worked the Dalton for a long time, who was known for tracking road conditions carefully and sharing what he found. The man had died during a winter run. He didn't make it into a ghost story. He just said the driver's last recorded radio transmissions were warnings to other vehicles about the conditions that eventually got him. He looked at me evenly when he finished, and then he went back to his truck. My dash camera has an audio system that captures ambient cab sound. It picks up my voice clearly when I'm on the radio. When I reviewed the footage from that run, my half of every exchange was present. The responses, where North Star's voice should be, were almost entirely absent. Not distorted, not corrupted in the way a bad signal sounds. Just not there. Almost entirely. At the section near mile 188, where he'd given me the first warning about the ice, there was something in the background of the recording. I played it through the cab speakers and leaned close and listened. A voice, partially buried under engine and road noise. I couldn't recover the words. But the cadence was there. That could be explained. A transmission from another frequency bleeding through a recording artifact interference. I've thought about each of those. I've also thought about why he knew my name. I still work remote northern routes. I've never heard that handle again. But when a voice comes over the CB on a dark stretch and gives me accurate information about what's ahead, I answer. Even when I can't see another truck. Even when dispatch doesn't know who it is. It seems like the only reasonable thing to do. Voices you can't locate. Taillights you can't reach. Some of the strangeness that finds you on empty roads never resolves into something you can see and name. The next driver was glad to have lights ahead of her. She was in the middle of one of the worst stretches of winter driving in the continental United States, and 3 trucks were giving her something to hold on to, right up until they weren't there anymore. Story 3. The 3 trucks in the snow Interstate 80, Wyoming. And say, my name is Carrie. I want to get straight to it because the part of this story that I'm still working through doesn't need much setup. Southern Wyoming in January is not a place that requires atmospheric description. I-80 across that stretch, speaks for itself to anyone who's driven it. High altitude, wide open, no terrain to block the wind, and the DOT will close it without hesitation when conditions warrant. That particular night the road was open, but open doesn't mean comfortable. The winds were running hard and variable. The snow was blowing horizontally through my headlights, and visibility was cycling between acceptable and poor, with no particular pattern. I'd been in it for about 2 hours when I picked up the taillights ahead of me. 3 semis, running in convoy formation spaced evenly, a couple hundred yards between each of them. Their lights gave me a reference point at road level, which in those conditions is worth more than it sounds. When you can't reliably see your own lane markers and the shoulder keeps appearing and disappearing in the blowing snow, having 3 sets of lights giving you a consistent horizon is genuinely stabilizing. I held my speed and kept a generous following distance behind the last truck. In those conditions, you increase your interval from the vehicle ahead, not reduce it. And I settled into the rhythm of following their track. For the first 20 minutes or so, this felt like ordinary convoy behavior during a bad storm. Drivers fall into line on I-80 in winter. It's practical. I wasn't questioning it. I started questioning it around the 40-minute mark. Their spacing never changed. I watched it through several long, exposed sections where the wind was working hard from the left, the kind of gusts that push a loaded trailer sideways and require real steering correction. The 3 trucks ahead of me absorbed all of that without any visible variation in their positions relative to each other. Not once did one of them surge or drop back a few lengths the way trucks do when drivers are managing active crosswind. The geometry between them stayed almost mechanically exact. Professional drivers can hold spacing well, but not that well. Not in those conditions, not for that long. Their trailers showed no readable markings. I'd been trying to catch company logos or DOT numbers from a distance, and the combination of distance and blowing snow was making it difficult. The reflective tape looked unusual, older, or a different specification than I was used to seeing. I noted it, but attributed it to the storm. I tried CB several times. Asked whether the lead truck in the convoy ahead was monitoring channel 19. No response. Tried 17. Nothing. I announced my position and asked whether anyone ahead of me was running westbound. Silence. Around the point where my navigation was trying to route me toward an alternate exit, a redirect I'd seen DOT promote on bad weather nights, I made a choice. The 3 trucks were taking the route I wanted, bypassing the alternate. I decided to follow their line rather than the GPS instruction. About 15 minutes after the split point, I started picking up radio chatter about conditions on the alternate route. Drifting, a possible stopped vehicle, advisory language about ice. I can't say for certain I'd have had serious trouble on that road, but the trucks had taken me the direction that turned out to be safer. I tried twice more to reach any of them on CB. Nothing. There was a long straight section somewhere past the midpoint of the bad weather, maybe a 9 or 10 mile run without curves or significant grade change. I could see all 3 sets of taillights, clearly the whole length of it. I eased my speed up by 4 miles per hour. Not enough to be unsafe, given my following distance, but enough that over 9 miles, I should have meaningfully closed the gap if they were traveling any speed close to mine. The lights stayed exactly where they were. I brought my speed back down. The lights stayed exactly where they were. This isn't how physics works. I know that. I also noticed in that straight section that the snow plume behind the last trailer, the rooster tail of disturbed air and snow that large trucks always throw up, was behaving strangely. It would appear, and then it would be hard to find, and then it would appear again. The normal turbulent signature of a heavy truck moving through snow wasn't quite consistent with what I was seeing. I can't fully articulate what was off about it. It just didn't look right behind a loaded trailer. Then there was a particularly hard gust, the kind that whites everything out briefly, and when it cleared, the road ahead of me was empty, not the gradual emptying that happens when trucks take an exit or pull onto a ramp. There was no exit, no crossroad. I know that stretch of I-80, and there was nowhere to go for several miles in either direction. The highway ran straight across open basin terrain, and there was nothing visible on either side. No access roads, no ranch entries, no turnoffs of any kind. 3 tractor trailers cannot leave a highway and drive into open range. That is not a thing that happens. I slowed and drove through the space where they had been. Just road. I continued for 2 more miles. Nothing in front of me and nothing in my mirrors. At a truck stop about 25 minutes later, I sat in the parking lot for a while before going inside. I pulled up the dash cam footage on my phone. The recording was intact. Weather rode the whole sequence. And the lights were there. 3 pairs ahead of me for most of the recording, but when I tried to identify the actual trailer shapes, the solid forms I'd been watching with my own eyes for nearly an hour, they were much harder to confirm in the footage than they'd been in person. The lights read clearly. The trucks themselves looked like taillights floating in the storm with shapes that came and went depending on the snow density in any given frame. I've watched that footage many times. I've never been able to get clean confirmation of 3 trucks from it, only 3 pairs of lights. A year later, I drove that section of I-80 on a clear September day and made a point of noting the geography at the location where the convoy vanished. Straight highway, flat basin, no exit, no access road wide enough for commercial vehicles, open range fence on both sides. Nothing. Nowhere that 3 semis could go that wasn't the road they'd been on. I don't know what I followed for an hour through that Wyoming storm. I've thought about optical explanations. Headlights from distant oncoming traffic refracted somehow through the snow into what my brain assembled as taillights ahead of me. I've thought about road fatigue and this pattern recognition. I've thought about what it would mean if neither of those explains it. I still use distant taillights as reference points in bad weather. But I don't automatically trust that whatever's making those lights is something I should follow. I should follow to wherever it's going. I count them now. Every time. Every driver develops a set of things they don't expect to see on their route. Things that fall outside the pattern of ordinary miles. Sometimes that pattern breaks in a small way that you can almost talk yourself out of. And sometimes something sits down in the middle of your night and refuses to move. No matter how many explanations you build around it, Roy has been trying to explain one particular night in Utah for several years. He's not the type to give up on finding a rational answer, which is part of what makes the fact that he hasn't found one so difficult for him. Story 4. The Inspection Station, U.S. Route 191, Utah. I'm Roy. Owner-operator, 21 years. I'll tell you right now that I don't have a satisfying conclusion to offer, and that irritates me because I'm not accustomed to leaving problems unsolved. The run itself was straightforward enough. I had dropped a load at a facility outside of Price, Utah, and I was heading south on Route 191 toward Moab, where I had a pickup scheduled for the following morning. Equipment heading out to a job site in Arizona. Running empty in the middle of the night is Not my favorite thing economically, but the timing worked and the contract was worth it. Route 191 southbound was the direct path, and it was a road I'd traveled enough times to know its character. Desert terrain, minimal traffic after midnight, the kind of run where you manage your alertness more than you manage the road. It was about 1:40 in the morning when I came up on the inspection station. Small facility on the right side of the road. Low building, set back from the shoulder maybe 30 feet, with a paved pull-through area under a covered section. Bright fluorescent lights, the older style, the kind that put out a yellow-green cast rather than the cleaner white of modern fixtures. A uniformed worker standing near the road with a light wand, waving me over. My first assumption was that I'd missed a checkpoint in my route notes. It happens. Portable inspection setups, temporary weight enforcement operations. The worker's signal was unambiguous, so I slowed and pulled in. The building had the worn, functional look of something that had been operating for decades without renovation, not deteriorated, clean enough, everything in its place, but accumulated. The kind of facility that gets repainted when the paint fails rather than on a schedule. Fluorescent tubes on the ceiling, one of them with a slow buzz. A round analog clock on the wall with a white face. A bulletin board carrying safety notices and regulatory posters that looked older than the current standards I was familiar with. A desk, a radio unit, a coffee machine with a pot that had gone past thick into something geological. 2 men in inspection uniforms. Both probably late 50s. Both completely professional in manner. The one at the desk asked for my paperwork, operating authority, log certification, registration, bill of lading. I passed it through the window. He reviewed it with the patience of someone who has done this thousands of times. Asked whether I was carrying anything hazardous. I explained I was empty, deadheading to Moab. He made a note. And then he looked up and told me he'd recommend I hold at the facility for a while before continuing south. I asked what the issue was. He said the road ahead wasn't favorable right now and that it would be better to continue after 4:30. I told him I had clean paperwork. I was within my hours, the weather was clear, and I had a pickup in Moab that I'd prefer not to complicate. I asked him to specify the actual problem. He looked at me steadily and said, "Missing an appointment is a lot cheaper than not making it at all." It's a reasonable sentence. I've said versions of it myself, but it's an odd primary justification from a checkpoint official who hasn't cited a closure, a construction delay, a hazmat spill, or any documentable condition. He just said the road ahead wasn't good right now, with the confidence of someone who had no intention of elaborating. I was about to push back more firmly when I noticed the wall clock. The second hand wasn't moving. The clock appeared otherwise functional. The hands were positioned correctly for the time. But the second hand was fixed. I watched it for 5 seconds. 10. Nothing. Clocks break. I told myself that and moved on. The second worker, who had been standing quietly by the interior doorway, said without being asked anything that my father had run western routes before the road numbering changed. He described my father's truck from the early 1970s. A specific color, a specific CB antenna configuration, details I knew only from photographs my mother had kept in an album. My father drove freight in the early part of his career, before I was born, before he moved into other work. This was not publicly documented information. It was barely something I knew in detail, let alone a stranger in a Utah inspection station at 2 a.m. I didn't pursue it. I've thought about why since, and the best I can determine is that The mind hits a threshold where the processing has to be deferred. I said I'd wait in my truck. I climbed back in, engine running, and told myself I'd give it 30 minutes and then leave, regardless of what they wanted. My paperwork was clean. They had no legal mechanism to hold me indefinitely. I woke up at 4:22. I had slept for somewhere between 2 and 2.5 hours, though it didn't register as sleep. There was no transition I could identify, no memory of getting drowsy. One moment I was sitting behind the wheel planning to wait 30 minutes, and the next, the sky had shifted to that particular dark blue that comes before the first gray of morning. I looked toward the building. It was dark. I climbed out to tell them I was continuing. There was no building. The area where the facility had been was empty. Gravel hardpan, a section of old chain link fencing that had clearly been in place for years, and a concrete foundation pad. The kind left when a structure is demolished and removed. The edges of the concrete were weathered. Desert scrub was growing up through the cracks. This was not a foundation from anything recent. Whatever had stood on that pad had been gone for a long time. No cable runs, no generator hookup, no sign of a temporary installation. Just old concrete and old fence and the desert. On my passenger seat was the inspection form. I had not picked it up from the desk window. I remembered passing my documents through. I had no memory of receiving this back. But there it was, a carbon copy style commercial vehicle inspection form, the kind I hadn't seen used in at least 15 years. My truck's information was recorded correctly on it. Plate, VIN, carrier number, all accurate. In the notes section at the bottom, handwritten, wait until 4:30. I drove south, about 31 miles down the road in the first thin gray of morning. I came to a section where orange cones and a single flagger were marking off a portion of the right lane. A rock fall from the embankment above had put significant debris across the roadway during the night. The flagger told me it had come down a few hours ago. Sometime between midnight and 3 was his estimate. In the dark at highway speed, I'd have had some warning from my headlights. Probably enough. I want to be precise about that. It was probably survivable. Probably. I've considered every reasonable explanation since. An emergency road management crew setting up and clearing out during the hours I was parked. That requires more infrastructure than one concrete pad in the desert. Some kind of facility that I've substantially misremembered due to fatigue. That doesn't explain the form on my seat. A medical episode of some kind, possible though I had no other symptoms before or after. The form exists. It has my truck's correct information. It was on my seat when I woke up. It contains a handwritten instruction that told me to wait until the time that would put me past the rock fall in daylight. The form has aged since then, the printed text, the pre-filled headers, all of it lighter than it was. The handwriting at the bottom remains completely legible, not dramatically darker, just still there while the rest of it fades. I keep it in my cab documents. It's the only piece of evidence I have that any of this occurred, and I am not sure what to make of a piece of evidence that I also cannot fully explain the existence of. Some drivers come away from unexplained nights with a form or a recording or something physical they can hold. Others come away with something harder to set down. Garrett drives U.S. Route 2 through northern Montana and has spent months going back through every piece of what happened on one particular October run. The data from his electronic logs, the geography of the road in daylight, a conversation with his daughter about a voicemail she received and saved. He described all of it carefully, in the kind of detail that comes from someone who has been over it many times, looking for the ordinary explanation. He has not found it. This is the last story tonight, and it's the one I keep coming back to. Story 5. The House That Followed Me, You. S. Route 2, Montana. My name is Garrett. I have a daughter named Michaela who was 15 at the time this happened and who lives with her mother in Billings. I'm telling you that at the start because the way this ends involves her. And you should know who she is before we get there. I'd been back doing long haul for about a year after several years on regional routes. The transition back to long distances suited me. I'd forgotten how much I liked the specific quality of attention required by remote roads at night. The way you have to be genuinely present because there's nothing to catch you if you're not. U.S. Route 2 across northern Montana is that kind of road. It runs through open agricultural land, small towns spaced far apart, and long sections where the only things at road level are your headlights and the reflectors ticking past. It was late October, cold, clear, close to no traffic. I was carrying a partial load, packaged equipment, light freight, properly blocked and strapped. About 4 hours into the run, mind clear, nothing unusual. The kind of night where the miles go by easily. I first saw the house around mile marker 312, give or take. Red farmhouse set about 100 yards back from the right side of the road. 2 stories. A front porch. A mailbox at the edge of the gravel drive where it met the shoulder. The house was dark except for one upstairs window. Warm, incandescent light, orange-yellow. The kind that old bulbs produce. In that window, slightly back from the glass, a silhouette. A person standing at the window facing the road. I registered it the way you register any occupied rural property. Someone up late. I moved on. 14 miles later, I saw it again. The first thing my brain did was the thing brains do. It tried to make it ordinary. Another farmhouse, similar construction. Montana has red farmhouses. 2 similar ones 14 miles apart is not impossible. I was willing to work with that, but this one had the same porch. The same mailbox at the same position on the same gravel drive. The same upstairs window with the same quality of light. And the silhouette was in the same position, the same general size and shape. I slowed slightly as I passed. The silhouette didn't move. I checked my navigation. Moving continuously westbound. No loops, no turns, no repeated road. I noted the mile marker and kept my speed up. 9 miles after that, the house appeared again. Not a similar house. The same porch, the same mailbox, the same window. The silhouette was closer to the glass. I ran through the fatigue explanation seriously at this point. Pattern matching from tiredness is a documented phenomenon. But I had slept well before this run. I was 4 hours in rather than 12, and I had not had any other perceptual disturbances. I decided to keep paying close attention rather than dismiss it. 4 miles after that, the house again. Porch light on now, a yellow fixture casting a small circle down the front steps. Front door open, not wide, maybe 2 feet. The interior dark behind the gap. The silhouette in the upstairs window was pressed against the glass, not standing back from it the way a person watching from inside a room stands back. Pressed against it, close enough that I could see the suggestion of a face. Pale. Looking down at the road. I passed without stopping and did not intend to stop. What I did was begin documenting. I noted mile markers each time. I confirmed heading and elapsed distance on the navigation, and I was not turning around. I was not on a loop. I was not revisiting any section of road. The numbers were consistent with continuous westbound travel. The house should not have been appearing every few miles. 3 miles later, it was ahead of me again. This time, something was standing at the mailbox at the end of the drive. Outside at road level, at the property line. Human in proportion, standing still, facing the highway, facing the direction my truck was coming from. It didn't move as I passed. I looked in my mirrors after clearing it and could not pick it out in the dark behind me. Then I checked the passenger side mirror, angling my focus back along the length of the trailer. The house was behind me, visible in the mirror. Same red exterior, same lighted upstairs window. At a distance that would put it somewhere behind the trailer, but not far enough behind it given how far I'd traveled since passing it. It appeared to have covered ground toward the highway that a fixed building cannot cover. I looked at the road ahead. A few minutes later, the house was in front of me again. I want to be precise about my mental state at this moment. I was not panicking. I was operating with the specific clarity that comes when something is sufficiently wrong that panic would be an indulgence. I was checking instruments, checking navigation, watching the road. I was functioning. I was also aware that I was watching a building appear ahead of me after I had driven past it repeatedly over a continuous westbound stretch of US Route 2, and that I had no framework for this. That was when the knocking started, a single heavy impact from inside the trailer. Enough that I felt a faint vibration come up through the seat. Then silence. Then 2 more. Slow and spaced. I gripped the wheel and went through the rational options. Freight shifting. Road surface transmission, a loose bracket somewhere in the cargo. Nothing I'd loaded should have the mass to create that kind of impact, and none of it was positioned in a way that could produce deliberate, rhythmic sound. 3 slow knocks, a pause of roughly 5 seconds, 3 more. That pattern is not road vibration. I got dispatch on the phone. Montana cell service on Route 2 at midnight is what it is. I got a partial connection. Enough to tell them I was continuing west and had a trailer concern. Asked them to log my position. The call dropped before they confirmed receipt. I went to CB and raised another driver. He was eastbound, running about 40 miles ahead of me in the other direction, but that didn't matter. The contact was what I needed. I told him I was hearing unusual sounds from my trailer and asked whether he'd stay connected until I reached a lit stop. He said yes without hesitation, the way drivers do. And we kept a loose conversation going for the next 20-something miles. Not constant talking, just enough to confirm we were both on the channel, enough to keep me from being entirely alone with whatever was happening behind me. The knocking continued at irregular intervals. It would stop for 10 or 15 minutes, and I'd almost convince myself it was done. And then it would come back. 3 and 3, always the same pattern, always with that deliberate spacing. Then it stopped entirely, and was quiet for a long time. I looked in my driver's side mirror. On or immediately behind the rear exterior of the trailer, near the area of the rear step used for accessing the upper door latch, there was a shape that should not have been there. Human in proportion. Still, moving with the truck in the way something moves, when it's part of the truck's motion rather than fighting against it, not struggling, not scrambling, just there. An oncoming vehicle came around a long curve behind me. Its headlights swept across the shoulder and the rear of my trailer. The step was empty. I put more throttle in and kept my eyes on the road ahead until I could see the fuel stop signage. I did not look in that mirror again. 3 other drivers at the stop walked the trailer with me. The rear door seal was intact, Padlock in place. Nothing disturbed. We opened the doors. Freight exactly as I'd loaded it. Nothing shifted, nothing loose. No sign of anything that shouldn't be there. Along the front interior wall of the trailer, low on the driver's side near the front bulkhead, there were several muddy footprints on the floor. Not a trail, not prints tracking towards something or away from it. A cluster of prints in one location, as if someone had been standing there for some time. The mud was damp. There were no prints approaching that location from anywhere. No prints leaving it. One of the other drivers stood there, looking at them for a moment, and said, quietly and without drama, that they shouldn't be there. We agreed that they shouldn't be there. Then we closed and resealed the trailer, and everyone went back to their trucks, because there was nothing else to do. Later, working through my electronic logging data, I found a discrepancy in a roughly 30-minute window. The distance my truck had traveled during that period was significantly less than the combination of my recorded speed and elapsed time should have produced. The GPS track showed continuous movement, no stops, no anomalous pauses. The numbers simply didn't resolve. I don't know what happened during those 30 minutes. My memory of that section of road is that it was continuous. I remember the CB connection. I remember the knocking. I don't know what I'm not remembering. When I was parked at the fuel stop, I checked my phone and found a text from Michaela sent around midnight, roughly 45 minutes earlier. It said, "Dad, did you try to call me?" I texted back, said no, asked why. She said she'd gotten a voicemail from my number. She'd tried to call back and it hadn't connected. There was no outgoing call in my call history. No record on the phone of a call being placed at any point during the run. I called her and asked her to play it. She hesitated before she did. The voicemail was road noise. Engine, tires on pavement, the ambient sound of a moving truck at night. Underneath it, irregular but consistent, knocking. The same pattern I had heard in the trailer. 3 and 3, over and over with the same intervals. I asked whether she heard anything else. She said she wasn't sure, and she'd rather not listen again. We left it there. In December, I drove Route 2 through that same corridor in daylight. I watched carefully for a red farmhouse across the entire relevant section. I drove it twice. No red 2-story farmhouse anywhere near the road. Not approximately, not partially visible through trees, not set far back from the shoulder. Nothing matching what I'd seen in October. I stopped at a hardware store in one of the towns along the route and asked the man at the counter whether he knew of an old red farmhouse along Route 2 nearby. He thought about it genuinely, said nothing came to mind. He wasn't being cagey. He just didn't know what I was describing. I thanked him and drove home. I've made a kind of peace with not having an explanation. There are things in a life that require that, and this is one of them. I don't know what I saw on that road. I don't know what was in my trailer or what left those prints or where they came from. I don't know what made the call from my phone that I have no record of placing. What I know is that my daughter saved that voicemail. About 3 weeks after the run, I was at her mother's house, picking Michaela up, and she had her phone out. I asked to hear it one more time. She handed me her earbuds. I sat and listened to the road noise. I listened to the knocking. And then I stopped trying to hear only what I expected to hear and just listened. Beneath the knocking, very quiet, partially covered by the sound of the road, a voice. Calm. Almost conversational. saying something that would have been easy to miss if you weren't listening close. You passed us again. I took the earbuds out and gave the phone back to my daughter. I haven't listened to it a third time. 5 drivers. 5 roads running through some of the most remote terrain in the country. What they have in common is not a personality type or a susceptibility to fear. What they have in common is mileage. Thousands of hours on highways where the nearest town is 40 miles away and the darkness extends further than your headlights can reach. Drivers who work these roads long enough develop a calibrated sense of what belongs out there. They know the sounds their equipment makes, the way weather moves across open terrain, the ordinary frequency of other vehicles at 3 in the morning. They know what normal looks like in conditions that most people never experience. That's the reason these accounts are difficult to simply set aside. These are not people encountering the unfamiliar. These are people whose entire professional training is to observe their environment accurately and who ran out of ordinary explanations. A cold seat with a latched seatbelt. A voice that knew a name it had never been given. 3 sets of taillights with nowhere to go. A handwritten instruction on a form from a building that wasn't there. A voicemail placed from a phone that has no record of making the call. We're not telling you what any of that means. We're telling you that 5 people drove into an enormous dark and came back with something they cannot leave behind. If one of these stories is still with you, tell us which one and why in the comments below. And if you drive for a living, if you've put serious miles on roads like these, we want to hear what you've seen out there. The drivers who spend the most time on remote American highways at night are the best qualified to know what doesn't belong there. If something didn't belong, leave a comment. A like takes about 2 seconds, and it helps YouTube put this channel in front of the people who'd want to find it. Subscribing means you won't miss what comes next. Take care of yourselves on the road. And if you're out there tonight, long stretch, no towns, nothing in your mirrors for the last 20 miles, that's probably nothing to worry about. Probably.